Okay then my friends, so it's time to move on to functions, which I think are a really fun part of JavaScript. And functions are probably one of the main building blocks in pretty much any programming language that you come across. And they fall under the object type in our data type list. Now, what functions allow us to do is define a block of code, which we can call and execute whenever we want. So I guess you could think of functions as a bit like a box with some code inside it that does a particular thing like this. Now, when we want to run the code inside that function, all we do is we call the function like this and it runs the code inside it. Now, later on, if we want to call it again, we can do, and it runs the code again. And this behavior is really useful because it means we're only defining the code inside the function once, but we can run it multiple times whenever we want, whenever we call it. So imagine we have a web page with a button on it, and every time a user clicks that button, we want to run the same bit of code. We could create a function which contains that code that we want to run, and then whenever a user clicks that button, just call the function to run the code. And we can do that whether the user clicks it twice or 10 times, it really doesn't matter. We define the code once in the function and run it or call it as many times as we want in the future. Now, we could also pass values into functions so that the function could take those values and do something with it, and then when it's done, spit out an updated value at the end. Now, an example of this would be to receive maybe a list of geo coordinates from a database that we want to convert into some kind of real address. We could write a function that takes in a latitude and a longitude value, and it grabs those and converts them into some kind of real address. So say we get a list of different coordinates, 50 of them in total. We're just defining the function once, then we could call the function 50 times. Only 3 times here because there's not enough room on the screen, but we could call it as many times as we wanted to, and we just pass in the different coordinates. And for each time we call it, it takes in those coordinates and spits out a real address. So this is the power of functions, to create little blocks of code that become reusable. So in this chapter, we're going to be looking at functions in a lot of depth, and we'll also take a sneak peek at how we could potentially use a function to interact with a web page. We're also going to be discussing what methods are a little more in this chapter, but not in too much detail just yet. Remember, a method is just a function which does something, but there is a small distinction between functions and methods, and we will discuss that as well. Alright then, so I'd like to show you how to create your first function. The first thing we need to do is write out the function keyword, then we give the function a name. I'm going to call this greet. So much like we give a variable a name, we also give functions a name too. Now after the name, we place our parentheses and then we do some curly braces. These curly braces are a code block for the function. So all of our code for the function goes inside this code block. Then whenever we call the function in the future, this is what is going to execute. So for now, I'm going to keep this simple and just do a console.log and say hello there. So then, now we have declared a function which we can then call at any point later on in our code. Now, if I was to save this at the minute and run it in the browser, nothing is going to be logged to the console because even though we've defined our function here, we've not actually called the function. So in order to call the function, we need to say the function name, which is greet. That's the name right there. Then we use parentheses to call the function. So this is known as calling the function or also invoking the function. So if I run this now, what it's going to do is see this. It's going to run the function, the code block for this function, and hopefully log this to the console. So over here, we can see, hello there. And if we wanted to run this again multiple times, we could do. So if I want to do it 3 times, it should log that 3 times. Okay then, so this way of creating a function is called a function declaration. We're declaring a function. Now, we can also store functions in variables and invoke them in a very similar way. So what I'm going to do is come down here and I'm going to create a const and call this speak. I'm storing this in a constant because I don't want to overwrite the function later on. So I don't want this to change. So I'm going to set this equal now to a function. We don't give this function a name here like we did up here because the name is now the constant or the variable. And we add our code block at the end. Now, this is known as a function expression. Basically, anytime you get a variable and set it equal to something, whether it's a function or a string or a number or something else, that is known as an expression, okay? And at the end of expressions, we should always have semicolons. So I'm going to put a semicolon at the end of this function. Now, we don't do a semicolon at the end of this function because this is not an expression. And this semicolon down here, this is probably one of the only times you're going to see a semicolon at the end of a code block when we use a function expression. So then, now we have this function stored in this constant. So inside this function, I'm just going to do something like console.log and then say good day. Okay, so how do we call this function? How do we invoke it? Well, we invoke it in exactly the same way. We just say speak and then parentheses. So the name of the constant followed by parentheses to invoke that function. So I'm going to comment these three out and save it and preview over here, and we can see good day now. Now I'm just going to duplicate this a couple of times, save it, and we can see we get 3 good days. So again, we can call this as many times as we want. So this is a function expression when we store a function inside a variable, and this is a function declaration when we don't. Now, most of the time, these two different ways of creating functions, they behave the same way, but there is a subtle difference when it comes to something called hoisting in JavaScript. Now, hoisting is a term that loosely describes how our functions are effectively hoisted to the top of a file before the rest of our JavaScript actually runs. So in essence, they're all declared before the rest of our JavaScript. And it does this with function declarations, but it doesn't do this with function expressions. So what that means is that we could potentially declare a function using a function declaration down here at the bottom of the file, and we could still run these things over here. Okay, so let me comment out speak and use greet, because what's happening is JavaScript is using hoisting to hoist the function essentially to the top of the file. That's a gross oversimplification, but essentially this is what the effect is. So even though we've defined it down here, it's effectively hoisting it up to the top, and therefore when we're using it here we can use it because it's already been defined by that point. Now if I save this and run it, we can see all of those greets right there. So this is still working even though the function comes after where we call it. So hoisting works with function declarations, but it doesn't work with function expressions. So if I take this one now and put it at the bottom and then try to use speak, then this is not going to work because JavaScript does not hoist function expressions, only function declarations. So if I save this and preview, now we get an error, speak is not defined. And that's because by the time JavaScript reaches this and tries to call speak or invoke speak, it's not yet been defined. This has not been hoisted to the top. So then, this might seem like a good idea to use this function declaration instead of function expression at first, but actually, it's not such a good idea. To me, it just seems jumbled up and it doesn't enforce a good coding practice when you're declaring things. So really, I think you should declare something first and then use it to keep a logical flow to your code. And if you don't do that, you could end up with a mishmash of functions and calls all over the place. Therefore, I prefer most of the time to use function expressions like this, which are not hoisted, so that we have to define our functions first at the top before we use them. So when I'm creating functions in the future, 99.9% of the time, I'm probably going to create them like this. Alright then, so sometimes we like to pass values into functions to do something with that value. For example, we could want to pass in some kind of name to the speak function up here, and then maybe output that name in the console. So to do this, we first declare that we want to receive some kind of value inside the function, and we do that inside the function parentheses. So we name this something, and I'm going to name it name, because that's what we want to receive. Now, what this does is create a local variable called name that we can use inside this code block. So if I wanted to, I could now output that inside here. So I'm going to convert this into a template string, which says good day, and then outputs the name. So if I try this at the minute, when we call it, we're not actually passing a value into the function. So this is not going to work. So if I save it and preview it, we can say good day undefined, which makes no sense. So what we have to do is actually pass a value into the function. So say for example, I come down here and say Mario and save it. What's going to happen now is we're going to call this speak function, but we're going to pass in this value as well. And then when the function is called, it takes that value and it assigns it to this name variable that we created. And now we can access that value inside the function. So if I save it now and preview, we can see that now it says good day Mario, because it's taken this value and assigned it to this local variable. Now we can't access the name outside of the function itself because it's a local variable, so that doesn't work. So when we're trying to do this, nothing's going to happen. This variable has the scope of this function and can only be used inside it. So then, when we pass in a value like this to a function, this right here, this is known as an argument. When we receive that value up here and we create these different values inside the function, these are called function parameters. Now, the two names are interchangeable and a lot of people get them mixed up, including me, so you'll probably sometimes hear me say this is an argument or this is a parameter and vice versa, but the names are just names. Most important is this idea of passing a value into a function which we can then use. Now, sometimes we might want to pass a few different values into a function. So we can do that by first of all declaring the different parameters in here, comma separated. So I'm going to take one in called time as well, and then same again down here, comma separate the arguments. So I'll pass in morning, and then we can output that. Instead of day, we can output the time. So we'll do that. So now it should say good morning Mario, because we're passing Mario and morning. So if I save this and preview, we can see good morning Mario. Now, the order is important. The order of the arguments must match the order of the parameters. We can't pass in the name second and the time first and expect that the function is going to know what those things are. No, it assigns the first thing here to the first thing here, the second thing here to the second thing here, third, fourth, and so forth. Okay? So then, what if we do something like this? Just call speak and we don't pass in any values. Then we've seen this, we get good, undefined, undefined. And that doesn't make sense. So to combat this, just in case a function is invoked without passing anything in, what we could do is give these parameters some default values. So I could say something like this: name is equal to Luigi, and the time is going to be equal to night. Now then, if we invoke the speak function, but we don't pass any arguments into the function, what's going to happen is the function itself will assign these default values to these parameters. So it will say good night Luigi. So if I save this, preview, we can see good night Luigi. But the moment that I pass in some arguments, for example, I'm going to say Sean and day, the moment I do that and invoke the function, these values are going to overwrite these values. So we can see good day Sean. So what happens if I just pass one of them in? Well, the first one will overwrite this value, but the second one will still be the default value because we've not passed in a second argument. So if I save it now and preview, we can see good night Sean. We get Sean, but night is still the default value. So then that is how we pass in arguments into a function and how we receive those as parameters inside the function, so then we can use them. Alright then, so when we've been creating functions so far, all we've been doing inside the function is logging something to the console, and that's fine, but we might not always want to do this. We might want to instead have the function return a value to us. For example, we could have a list of radiuses, or radii, I think the plural is called, which we get from either a user or a database or something else. And we might want to pass each of those radii into a function that calculates the area of a circle. Now, we don't want to log the area of the circle each time we call that function. Instead, what we want to do is receive that area value back so we can do something with it later on. So let's create this function. First of all, I'm going to comment this old one out, and down here I'm going to create a new constant called calc area and set this equal to a function, and this function is going to take in a parameter which I'll call radius. And inside the function, we want to calculate the area of a circle. So we'll do that. We'll say let area equal to pi, which is 3.14, times the radius squared, so to the power of 2. So now we have that area value. But we don't just want to log it to the console. We don't really want to say console.log area, because if we do that, then if we call the function later on, calc area, and pass in some kind of radius, then it's going to log this to the console, but then we can't do anything with that area later on down the file because it's not stored in memory anywhere. It's only stored locally inside the function. So we see the area right here, but if we try to use the area later on, then it's not going to work. I can't say console.log area. That's not going to work because this is a local variable now inside the function only. So instead, it would be nice to return this area value. So we can do that by using the return keyword and then the thing that we want to return. In our case, we want to return this variable, area. So now when we call this, we're not logging the area to the console anymore. Instead, we're returning a value. Now what's going to happen? If I save this and come over here, we don't see anything. So what we need to do is take the value that is returned to us and do something with it. Now, when a function returns a value, what we need to do is store that value in some kind of variable. So what I'm going to do is say const area is equal to calc area and then pass in 5. So what this does is call a function, it returns the area, and the area now is returned here, so it's set equal to this new constant which has global scope area. So I could say now console.log area, area, and that's going to work. So if we save this and view, we can see it. And these two things don't have to be called the same, by the way, they just happen to be called the same. So if I want to call this A and console.log A, that would still work. Okay, we're just storing the value that we get back, regardless of what it's called here, inside this new constant. Okay, I'm going to change that back to area because it makes more sense to me. So that's how we return a value. Now, just a little bit of cleanup here. What I want to do is get rid of the return here and just place it directly here. So we don't need to store this in a local variable first of all. We can just return it directly. That's going to calculate this value and return that value directly. So that's just a bit of cleanup. So this is still going to work. Refresh and we still get 78.5. So the benefit of this is that we can now take this area and do something with it. We could create another function to calculate the volume and pass in the area. For example, we could say const calc vol is equal to a function which takes in an area, and inside that we'll do something to calculate the volume. Now we could call this later on by saying calc vol and pass in the area right here. Okay, so we're able to reuse a value that a function brings back to us. And I forgot my semicolon there. I'm going to save that. So there we go, my friends. That is how we can return values from functions. Alright then, gang, so arrow functions are a more modern addition to the JavaScript language, and they offer us a cleaner and shorter way to write functions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this function that is a regular function, we've already seen this, to calculate the area, and I'm going to turn this into an arrow function and show you how we do this. So I'll keep this here as reference, but what I'm going to do is come down here and create a new constant, and I'm going to call this calc area. It's the same name, but we'll comment this one out later on. And when we create an arrow function, we set it equal to, first of all, parentheses. We don't use the function keyword. So the parentheses right here, they take in any parameters that we have. So we have the radius. So let's pass that in. Then we do an arrow, which is equals and then the chevron. And then we open up our code block. At the end, we can still do our semicolon. Now inside this code block, this is where we do the function body, which is this kind of thing right here. So now then, this is an arrow function version of this regular function. And it's just a bit shorter. We don't have to write out the function keyword right here. So it's a bit easier to create. Now, if I comment out this thing, I'm calling this function right here. So it should work. So let me save it and come over to the browser. And we can see that we get 78.5 for the area. So this is still working, this arrow function. Okay, it's just a newer and shorter way to write functions. Now, we can simplify this even more. The first way we can simplify this is using these parentheses, or rather taking them away. When we only have one parameter, we can take away these parentheses. And this is still going to work. If I save it and refresh, we can see we still get that. Now this only works when there's exactly one parameter. If we were to pass in two parameters, then we need the parentheses. So radius and then something else. We need the parentheses there when there's more than one parameter. Likewise, if there's no parameters, we also need the parentheses there. We can't just take them away because that wouldn't be an arrow function. We need the parentheses there when there's 0 parameters or more than one. But if there is just one parameter, we can take away the parentheses like that. Okay, so the next thing we can do, when we just have a single return like this on one line, we can actually take away the return keyword and we can scoot it up to the same line over here, and we can take away the code block curly braces like so. And now what this does is return this value. Even though we don't write out the return keyword like that, it still returns the value. Look, if we try to return here on one line, we get a squiggly line under it, meaning that's not what we're meant to do. We just write out the value that we want to return. If I wanted to return a value which was hello, I write it there and it would return that. And then this right here would get the value of hello, whatever is returned. I don't want to do that. I want to return this thing, which is the area. If I save it now and run it, then this still works. So this kind of syntax, if you're comparing it to this, is now a lot shorter and a lot easier to write. So remember, one parameter, and we can remove the parentheses any more and we need them, or any less and we need them. And if we're just returning something very simply on one line, we can move it up to the next line, remove the return keyword, and also remove the curly braces. So there is another major difference between a regular function like this and an arrow function. And that is to do with the binding of the this keyword, which we've not covered yet. And that means there will be times when arrow functions shouldn't necessarily be used. But I don't want to delve into that just yet. It's beyond the scope of this video, pun intended, but we will cover that at a later time. Now, as a little exercise, just to get used to arrow functions, what I've done is I've created some regular functions down here. So I'm just going to cut those and I'm going to paste them up here like so, and delete all this space. We don't need that. And I'm going to just get rid of all this because we don't need these anymore. And what we're going to do is just practice turning regular functions into arrow functions. So right here we have another simple regular function. So if you want to pause the video right here and try it out for yourself, then unpause and watch how I do it. That's absolutely fine. But what I'm going to do now is do an arrow function version of this function. So I'm going to say const greet is going to be equal to a function. We don't have any parameters, so we need the parentheses. Then we do our arrow. Then we do our code block. I'm going to return hello world. Now, because we're doing a simple return on one line, we can remove that keyword, and we can also scoot this up and remove these things right here. So this is the arrow function version of this. And if I try to call this now, I'm going to call greet, and I'm going to comment out this so there's no conflict, and save it. This should work. Oops, we need to log it to the console. So let's say const test or result is equal to this because we're returning a value, and that's going to be stored in result now. So now we can say console.log results and save it and preview, and we can see that. Okay, so let's do the next example. I'm going to comment that one out and uncomment this. This one's a little more complex. So we have this const called bill right here set to a function, and it takes in 2 parameters. Then inside we're creating this local variable called total, and we're cycling through the products. So we can see that products must be some kind of array, and for each product we're getting the total and we're adding the product value plus any kind of tax. Okay, so just a simple formula. Then in the end we're returning the total. So this is more than just a simple return statement. Now what I'm going to do is come down here and I'm just going to console.log, and we're going to console.log the bill function, and we're going to pass in a couple of parameters, or arguments in this case. So the first one is the product, and this is going to be an array of prices essentially. So we're going to take in the first one, which is 10, we'll do 15 and 30. After that we need a second argument, which is the tax, and that's just going to be 0.2 for 20%. Now I'm logging this directly in the console instead of storing this in some kind of variable and then logging it to the console like we did here, but this is exactly the same, okay? It's just a shorter way of doing it. We're logging it directly. Okay, so we have that. Let's just make sure it works, save it, and we get this as the total over here, 66. So we know what it should be. So we're taking those products in, we're cycling through them. For each one, we're adding to the total variable over here. We're taking the product price plus any tax on that price, which is 0.2 times the product price. Then we're returning the total. So let's convert this now into an arrow function. So what I'm going to do is say const bill is equal to parentheses. We have more than one parameter, so we need our parentheses. We're taking the products and we're also taking the tax. Then we need our arrow, then the curly braces. Then we'll do our semicolon. Okay, so inside this function, what we're going to do is create the local variable, so total equal 0. And in fact, we can just copy this stuff right here. We don't need to totally rewrite it again, like so. Now, we can't shorten this to one line because we have all of this extra logic right here, and that doesn't work with arrow functions on one line. It only works when we have one simple return statement, like we did up here. We're just returning something simple, or with the area example. In here, we have a lot more logic, so we can't just scoot this up to one line, but we can still have an arrow function, which is still a bit shorter than a regular function, okay? So this is the arrow function version of this. There's not that much difference. We just remove the function keyword and add on the arrow. That's all we're doing essentially. So let me comment this out and make sure this one still works. We're calling it down here, save it and preview, and we still get 66. So then, a lot of the time in this course, I will be using arrow functions as we go forward. So if you ever need a refresher, do come back to this video. And like I said, there is another major advantage of arrow functions in some cases when it comes to the this keyword. Sometimes it's a disadvantage, and we'll talk about that later on. Alright then, so hopefully now you're going to be quite clued up as to what a function is. It's a block of code to do something that can be invoked and run at any point in our code. So now I want you to cast your mind back to when we were talking about strings and numbers and other data types. Now we use something called methods on those data types which did something for us. And I said that methods and functions are kind of synonymous with one another because they do the same thing, right? They can be invoked to run a bit of code which does something for us. So a method is just a function. Now what distinguishes methods is the way that we invoke them and where they are defined. Now if we have just a regular function or an arrow function, and in fact I'm going to create this, I'll say const greet is equal to an arrow function, and this arrow function is just going to return a value hello. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to store a result, we'll call it result1 equal to greet. So now when we invoke this function like this, we're getting this value back and we're storing it in this variable. So we could log this to the console. We'll just log result1 and this will work. So we should see hello. So notice when we invoke this regular arrow function, we just invoke it like this, the function name and then parentheses. Now, when we use a method, the method is invoked using dot notation. So remember, we could take a string and use a method on it called toUpperCase. And the way we do that is by taking that string and saying dot toUpperCase. So the value, then dot notation, then the method name. Now this is still just a function, right? But the way we invoke it is different. We're using dot notation right here on the value itself. Whereas here, we're not doing that. We're just invoking it directly by saying the function name and then parentheses. In both cases, we do still use parentheses, and in both cases, we can pass in arguments to them. The only difference in how we're calling them is that we're calling a method on the back of something using dot notation. So what I'm going to do is store this in a result as well. So let result2 equal to this thing, and then I'm going to console.log result2, and this is going to work. So I'll save it and preview, and we can see this right here shown. So then, methods are functions, but they're functions which are associated with an object or data type if you like a string. They're defined on an object or data type, whereas our function was just defined here on its own, not on an object or data type. So we've not covered objects yet, so I don't want you to freak out thinking you don't know what they are, but they're one of the 7 data types in JavaScript. In the future, we will look at objects and then create our own methods on our own objects, and we'll also be using many methods built into the JavaScript language like this thing right here as well. But for now, I just wanted to plant the seed to let you know that these methods that we use are still just functions that do something for us. They're essentially the same thing, just with a different name, and the difference is how we call them and where they are defined. So that is good enough for now. Okay then, so we know now what functions are, hopefully, and we know that methods are functions too. And we've also seen that we can pass arguments into functions and methods when we invoke them, and we can use those values, those arguments, inside the function. Now, so far those arguments that we've been passing in have just been things like strings or numbers or something, but we can also pass in a function as an argument. And when we do this, the function we pass in is called a callback function. So take a look at this example. I've created here a function called myFunc. It's an arrow function, and it takes in as a parameter a callback function. Now this can be called whatever you want. You don't have to call it callback function. This is just what I've called it. So inside this function right here, we do something, and then at some point the idea is that we call this callback function, okay? So when we invoke myFunc, we need to pass in some kind of function as a parameter. So what I'm doing is calling myFunc down here, and let me just cut this for a second so you can see we're just calling the function like that. Then as an argument, instead of passing in like a string like we normally would, instead what we're doing is we're passing in a function as an argument. So this is just a regular function using a function keyword, and inside it does something. Now when we call the callback function up here, what we're doing is calling that callback function, and we're passing in this value as an argument. This value is something we define inside the function up here. So inside the callback function, when we pass it in, we have to declare that parameter, because when we call it, we're going to be getting a value inside it. So now that value is passed into this callback function when it's called, and we can log it to the console if we want to, or do something else with it. So if I save this and preview, we can see that value logged to the console. Now, this seems like a lot of work to do just this, what I've just done, but this is just to demonstrate the general premise of a callback function. We pass a function into something, another function, as an argument. And at some point in that other function, that callback function will probably be called and maybe passed a value, which we can take in. So that's the general premise. Now what I'm going to do is convert this into an arrow function right here. So first of all, I get rid of the function keyword. Then we need an arrow like so. And then because there's only one parameter right here, then we can just delete these parentheses. So this is exactly the same. And this, a lot of the time, is how you're going to see callback functions defined, okay, when we pass them into another function. So that's the general premise when we're creating our own function here and taking in a callback function. We define that callback function right here. Okay, so now we know that, what I'm going to do is delete this, and you can see here I've created a variable called people, and this is equal to an array of different people. They're all strings. Now what I'm going to do now is use a built-in array method. Okay, so remember, methods are just functions. We're using a function on this array. So I'm going to take people, and this method is called Foreach. Now then, Foreach is a method which iterates over an array. It's a bit like a loop where we iterate over some kind of array, but in my eyes, this is a little more elegant. Now this Foreach method expects as an argument in here a callback function. So let's do this as a regular function first of all, because sometimes I think it's easier to visualize this way. So, like so. And then if I say in here console.log, and we'll say, I don't know, something. So what this Foreach method does here is it iterates through an array, and the array it's iterating through is people. And for each element inside that array, it calls this callback function. So this is going to log out for each element inside that array. So we should see it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times, because the function is going to fire 5 times, once for each element in the array. So if I save it and preview, we can see we get 5 right there next to something. Okay, so it's done it 5 times. Okay then, now inside this callback function we can actually take a couple of different parameters. The first one is whatever the value is at the time that we're iterating over. So every time we fire the function for each individual element, we get that element as our first parameter. Now I'm calling it person because it makes sense to use the singular of people, because these are all people, so each one is a person, but you can call it whatever you want. You can call it val if you want, it doesn't matter. I call it the singular of whatever this is. So now we can log out the person each time around. So that should be Mario, then Luigi, then Ryu, then Sean, and then Chun-Li. So let's save it, and we can see those right here. Okay, so again, all we're doing is iterating through this array using for each and firing a callback function, which we pass through as a parameter, or an argument rather, to the for each method for each individual item in the array, and we get access to that person in the array each time around. Okay then, so now let's convert this into an arrow function right here, because that's mainly how you're going to see this written. So we delete the function keyword and we add our arrow right here like so. Now because there's only one parameter, we can delete this if we want to. So now it's just person into the arrow function. So if we save this, it's going to do exactly the same thing. All right, so you're going to see me write callback functions like this a lot of the time using arrow functions. Now then, this callback function right here inside for each not only takes the value of each individual element as a parameter, but we can also take in a second optional parameter, and that is the index of the element. So when we fire the function for the first time, it's going to be 0 because that's the index. Then the second time, it's going to be 1 because that's the index. Then 2, then 3. So we could log out the index and the person. So if we save that and preview, we can see now we get the index and the person. So they're the two different parameters we can pass into this function. Now, if you wanted to, you could define a callback function somewhere else and then just pass it in to the for each method or whatever method we're using. Now, to do that, I'm going to come up here and create a new const, and I'm going to call this log person. And this is going to be equal to an arrow function. We take in the person and the index, much like we did down here. Then inside this function, I'm going to just log a template string. So I'm going to say console.log and then a template string. We're going to output first of all the index variable, and then I'm going to output a dash, and then I'll say hello and then the person. Okay, so now we've created this function, what I can do is use this function as a callback function for this method. So instead of defining the function here now, we're defining it up here. And now I could just say log person, like so. And what we're doing is essentially passing this arrow function into this for each method. It's doing exactly the same thing, and this should still work. So, although it's spelled incorrectly, helo, we still get the desired results. So a lot of the time, you're going to see me write callback functions directly in here, especially when they're just small functions, because I think it's easier than writing separate functions out here somewhere then passing them in. It looks nicer as well. But sometimes if we have a large function, then we're going to externalize them, create them somewhere else, and then pass them in as a callback function. So hopefully now you understand what callback functions are. They're just normal functions that we pass into another function or another method as an argument. Okay then, so now we know what callback functions are, I'd like to have a little look at one in action. So what I've done is I've gone to the index.html and I've already added this UL with a class of people. And in sandbox.js we have this constant people, which is an array of different people. Now what I'd like to do is use for each to iterate through each one of these elements, each name. And for each one, we're going to fire a callback function because we pass that through as a parameter or an argument to for each. So that function is going to generate some kind of HTML template for each one of these different elements, and it's going to output that to the browser inside the UL. Does that make sense? Okay, so then first of all, let's come down here and say people.forEach. And what we're going to do is pass a callback function into this, and we'll convert this into an arrow function later on. But for now, let's just take in the person each time around we fire this, which is the element that we're currently iterating over. So what I'd like to do now is create an HTML template for each one, for each person. So I'm going to say up here outside of the foreach method, let HTML equal to an empty template string. So backticks. Now inside here, what we're going to do is append to this HTML for each person. So I'm going to say HTML plus equals, which takes the current value of HTML and adds more to it. And what we're going to do is concatenate a bit of a template string. So li we'll do first of all, and this is going to have a style property set to color, and we'll color these purple and then close that off. Then inside the li we want to output the person, so we'll do that right there. And then after the person we close the li tag. Okay, so what we're doing for each person is we're adding this snippet, this template, onto the HTML. So each time around, each time we fire this callback function for each element, we're adding this onto the HTML. Okay, so by the end of it, the HTML is going to look like a big list of li tags. So let me just log this to the console, console.log the HTML. Okay, so let's save this and view it in a browser. And we can see this is the final HTML code. So we want to take this now, which is a series of li tags with the different names inside it, and we want to output it to the browser. Now, we've not covered any kind of browser interaction yet. We don't know how to do this kind of stuff, and I don't expect you to understand what I'm about to do. But the first step is to get a reference to an element on the page. Well, we want the UL. That's where we're going to inject our HTML. So I say UL is equal to document.querySelector, and then I grab that UL by using a CSS selector .people. That gets the people class. Okay? Again, I don't expect you to understand this much yet. We're going to cover this later. Then what I'm going to do is take that UL, because we stored it right here, and I'm going to set the inner HTML property to be the HTML that we just created, which is this variable. So when we do that, it takes this HTML, it grabs this UL, and it places this HTML inside the UL. Okay, so let me save that and preview, and now we can see all of this stuff right here. If I inspect that, then we can see inside the UL we have all of these different li tags. So that is just one use of this for each and a callback function to create some HTML templates for data. We're going to do much more of this stuff later on when we start to work with the DOM and the browser and this as well. So again, don't feel like you have to understand it all now. I just wanted to give you a quick example of how we could use for each and a callback function to good use. One last thing, I do just want to convert this into an arrow function. So let's take away the function keyword. We can take away the parentheses because we only have one parameter, and we do our little arrow finally, and that is absolutely fine. We can leave it like that. So save it, let's see if this still works, and it does.